So I'm working for a network that's dealing with transport. So our focus of Polis is urban mobility innovation. So I've been asked to speak here, and the starting point is transport. So I will talk about how our sector and our members work with housing and look at housing and planning and governance at different governance levels. So that's the starting point of the presentation. So what is important to understand from the side of transport is that we are a derived demand. That's the definition everybody learns when you enter a transport class or a transport 101 class. So that means that people seldomly use transport or seldomly move for the movement as such, except for all the Strava aficionados in the room. So basically we move to be economically or societally active, to go elsewhere to do a meaningful activity. And that also brings the relation to housing in a very specific of transport to housing in a specific context. So that means that when we talk about mobility, in many cases, it is there to accommodate the ability of people who live somewhere to take a meaningful economic or cultural or educational or societal activity elsewhere away from the housing. So that's also the perspective of the presentation. We are there to serve you. So that's important to highlight that at the start. The relation between housing and transport is set at different levels, and I will present these in my short talk. 3 levels: the macro, the meso, and the micro level. Starting from the helicopter view, let's say, the map of Europe, where we have the Trans-European network as the basic transport strategy, transport infrastructure strategy, where elements like functional urban areas, sustainable urban mobility plans come about. And I'll explain a bit what that all is and what the relation is to housing. So last year, 2024, the European Union has decided on a new strategy, a new vision for transport infrastructure in Europe, the Trans-European Network for Transport. And what is new and very interesting is the recognition of 432 urban nodes in this network. It's the small white dots on the map, but there are many more than what you see on the map. And all of these nodes are recognized in their functionality of being important hubs for movement of people and goods, and basically creating the economic added value of the network. And what's more important for this discussion is that these nodes, the urban nodes, need to prepare a sustainable urban mobility plan by 2027. And the plan is there to, I'm going to skip that, the plan is there to cover the functional urban area of the node. So it's not only the core city that needs to plan, but you need to plan for the entire daily commuting system. And then, of course, if we read down into the legal text, finally, transport people recognize that in that context, when we start to plan for the daily commuting system, the transport plan needs to have a relevant need to link to relevant land use and spatial planning. So there is a prompt from the European legislator, which doesn't always which is not so common, a prompt for the transport sector to work with the land use and spatial planning sector. There's a lot of discussion on this at the moment. So the 2027 deadline for the plan is coming up. And the first question that the urban nodes have is, how do we govern the planning process? How do we govern the functional urban area for this purpose? Because the legal territorial boundaries do not overlap with the in most cases with the daily commuting system, with the functional urban area. The transport network competent authorities are not those who, in some cases, who manage land use planning, who decide on housing, housing locations, etc. So the can of worms is open, and we are trying to solve that problem. To really find the best local settings for mobility plan development where sectoral concerns are taken on board. From the plan, you also see, and the planning logic, you see an understanding or a recognition that different spatial typologies, different housing patterns will require a different modal hierarchy. So this is the example of Eindhoven in the Netherlands, who really have said or have recognized in their plan that if we look at the bigger metropolitan mobility system, the car has a priority together with public transport. But when we zoom in to high density neighborhoods with lots of economic functions, with a lot of dense housing and economic activity, we need space efficient modes, walking and cycling. So there is this there as well. There is this link between prioritizing transport networks and changing the design of transport networks in function of the spatial patterns and the housing densities. So we move down a level from the functional urban area to the city, and there the big one of the important governance mechanisms is the climate city contract, which is implemented in 120 cities and cities in Europe to become climate neutral by 2030, which is a very steep ambition. But this also is something that that is happening, and that translates in housing and transport and combined activities. And it also translates this, going back a bit, this ambition or this recognition that different spatial typologies will have a different modal hierarchy. So this is also really taken on board in these plans. Yeah, so a lot of the climate neutrality planning is moving forward. You see here an example of plans from Leuven, Amsterdam, Stockholm, Glasgow, each writing down their ambitions with timelines going to the next decade, but also, yeah, looking at really concrete climate neutral neighborhoods and sectors in the cities. So I mentioned the Climate City Contract. It's an investment program which is designed based on a European guideline designed with and by cities in a large support activity called Net Zero Cities. And these climate city contracts have the ambition to coordinate climate neutrality in housing and in buildings, but also in the energy and the transport sector, and also looking for the synergies between these sectors. And I will give a couple of examples later on. There is also another legal framework at the European level that is important here. It's the Nature Restoration Law, And there are urban interventions obligatory in that legislation that really ask for a strong reconsidering for public space, renaturing of cities, which also, of course, has an impact on the quality of living in cities and of housing. And also brings planning and design questions to the table for public authorities. The plan that I mentioned before also has, of course, an impact at this local level, at the city level, because the locations where intermodality is happening and where people change between transport modes, but also, for instance, a larger parking locations are listed in that plan or described in the plan. So an important, that slide came out worse than I thought. An important link between housing and transport is the understanding of accessibility of places where people live. So that's a very important aspect. And I brought a couple of tools from Belgium in that regard. There's the MobiScore, which is a tool designed by the Flemish region, where each homeowner or potential homeowner can find, on the basis of an address, an accessibility score based on public transport, access to education, access to shops and services, access to leisure, and also to healthcare. And on the map, you see the blue spots have the best accessibility. The red spots have worst accessibility. Now, when this was published, when this was launched, this was very controversial. People were very upset by seeing how badly their location was scored, for instance, because, of course, it also links to the market value of housing. But it's a very important tool, specifically in a region that is moving very strong in the direction of total car dependence, where public transport is not obvious. So these are the tools who make that very clear for the potential or current homeowner, but also for authorities. And on the right side of the slide, you see another tool also from the Flemish region, specifically to support the local authorities. A tool for walkability and cyclability was designed to help local authorities to improve, by very targeted local measures, access to housing, access or the mobility of people who live there, by giving them better access to public transport, education, etc., with a focus on active travel. A final, something important here that I want to raise, and I'll move on, is a European fund, the Social Climate Fund, which will give money to the member states to combat transport poverty. Transport poverty often also caused by the location where people live. We move down another scale, going to the district or to the building, where we see that a lot of cities really choose for placemaking and quality of living as the core target at neighborhood level, with the 15-minute city or the 15-minute district approach, but also looking at air quality, at speed in cities, but also this idea of working on heat management in neighborhoods, while still taking all these measures, while still allowing for economic activity, bringing logistics goods into the neighborhoods in a way that it doesn't hinder too much. So a lot of that activity is happening in cities, and we must say, has increased the quality of living in many European cities. Coming closer to the building and to the house, there is, of course, the aspect of energy, which is very important. And we see that vehicles become an important part of the energy system. With the electrification of the fleets, we are connected. The car or the van or the bicycle is plugged into the building. It needs space for that. There's also European legislation that requires new and renovated housing to create space for new mobility, for electric charging, for bikes. And that also translates into the concept of positive energy districts, the idea that we design neighborhoods with energy systems that are not only neutral, but even might be producing energy for functions outside the district. And that, of course, you need to plan for and govern all the mobility spaces that are used in neighborhoods. Parking of vehicles need to be charged. There is pickup and drop-off of people and of goods. That all needs to be managed. So then we come very close to the building as well. So parking is a factor in this regard. I will speed up a bit, but parking in many cases is the closest link between transport and housing. It's a very difficult equation to solve. Adding parking to housing increases the costs enormously, and we see that that often the question is then, if we don't internalize the cost of parking inside the building, we will push it out to society, and society will have to cater for parking in the public space or through public parking functionalities. And we also have, of course, we inside the building, we take space away from other functions in a building, and we focus on one function of space, the parking space, which is designed only for a car and not useful for any other use of a building. Of course, you also you create an aspect of mobility for the residents if they own a car, which is not a given. Car ownership is often much lower than what policymakers expect it to be. But also in the future, if we really see the vehicles as part of the energy system, and we have bidirectional charging where the vehicles feed back to the grid in times of peak or peak needs, then of course you need a place to store such a vehicle or a battery on wheels. So these are all very complex questions to govern and to manage. Luckily, we have guidance on that. I'll give a couple of examples. The Share North project has worked on a guideline to integrate shared mobility into new housing developments. Very interesting. So basically the principle is that the developer can reduce the parking offer in the building if the developer commits to maintaining shared mobility services throughout a couple of decades of use of a building. And that, of course, creates enormous opportunities for the people who live in the house, but also reduces the cost of the development. Cobras is a very interesting scheme in Brussels, where the Brussels region, and now I have to be a bit technical, but they basically make parking standards that are there for new building, new housing, new offices, parking standards that apply for these new buildings. They backtrack that to existing building stock. So that means that you don't get an advantage by not renovating a building, for instance, and having a lot of parking space. So you have to reduce the numbers of parking in old buildings, or you are taxed for these spaces, or you can also make them accessible for the neighborhood, for instance. So it's a very interesting scheme to make use of existing parking stock and not have additional negative aspects, negative impacts of high parking volumes on neighborhoods that then attract too much traffic. Before drawing my conclusion, I want to end with one very specific operational problem when it comes to housing and transport, and that's the aspect of oversizing. It's a bit away from this discussion, but it's somehow very closely linked to planning and how we control this problem. First, starting with the volumes of vehicles that we have. So this is a graph from Flanders in Belgium, where you have a very big segment of daily trip length of about between 10 and 40 kilometers, 10 and 50 kilometers. And these are trips that are very difficult to replace with trips by public transport. So this is, and it's also a bit too long to cycle. So these are trips by car. And because there is not a lot of alternative, the overall growth in car ownership increases. So this is the graph from 2006 to 2023, where you get a gradual increase of person vehicles that are registered. It's not different in other member states, so this is really happening everywhere. And all of these vehicles require at least one parking space a day. So this is eating space, and space equals money, equals quality of life. So this is really an issue, the growing volume of vehicles. How do we cope with that in our built environment? So because we cannot, we can create a little bit of extra space, but at an enormous cost. Then the second problem with the extra large is the size of the vehicles itself. So we all love this beauty on the roads. We take quite a lot of action together with other networks to keep it out of Europe, and we have been successful so far. So we don't want this to be the new normal on European roads. But what we see is anyway that vehicles become bigger, and yeah, sorry, this is still in Dutch, but so this is not only an issue of size of the vehicle, but also the turning cycle, the width of the doors. So it's not really an urban planning question, but it is, because this all requires another way of designing buildings, designing street space, if this trend is happening as it is. It also means that it's very difficult to start retrofitting buildings, and that's, for instance, a huge problem in social and public housing, where if you start to renovate for climate reasons, for energy reasons, for quality reasons, you have to then also start to rethink the entire underground parking based on which standard. So and that costs enormously, because also the entire casco of the building is designed for smaller vehicles. I'm very emotional about this because it's a very annoying topic, but it's super important. So yeah, cars are getting bigger. Think about that. I mean, it's something to solve in this whole discussion. So a conclusion. I mentioned a couple of levels of where the discussion is playing in Europe, at the European level, the city level, the neighborhood level. And then you have the different sectors, housing, energy, transport. So we have to, yeah, there's only one advice, is to see the complexity and embrace it. So first and for all, there is this interaction between where the housing is located, what the private mobility offer is, or the the needs and desires of people. Do they own a car? Do they want a car, or do they need? Are they pushed into car ownership due to the lack of the public mobility offer, or does that work well together? Another layer is the parking system, which is very important. So the standards that are put to housing in view of providing access to privately owned vehicles or to other mobility services. And that, of course, with mobility becoming electric in the next decade, that is very closely linked to the energy system and the mobility system we want, being either individual cars or shared mobility and public transport. And finally, there are also the different stakeholders in this equation, where somebody, and that's my last statement, somebody very wise, Minze Walvius, if you ever would meet him, he said, like, if you look at rotation in all these different aspects of housing and transport, and a civil servant in a city stays there 5 to 10 years. The developer leaves after after the building is set, in most cases. Residents, if they don't own the house, they move also 5 to 10 years. So who is the actual long-term stakeholder? Right? That's also something to understand and a party to address in this context. So yeah, I will stop here. I've touched upon a lot of elements, and I'm happy to take comments. But this is a topic that's very hot in Europe at the moment, with a new transport commissioner, but also for the first time a commissioner for housing. So this issue of lack of housing is a very big issue at European level also. And I'll stop sharing now.
Ivo, thank you very much. Thank you very much for highlighting the integral connection between housing and planning and mobility, and also pointing out the difficulty, the challenge with the governance of it, because it's different systems of governance. It's different authorities. There's all sorts of different cross sections that need to be straddled or managed. I would like to ask if there are any immediate questions now to Ivo, but we will also be able to return after Tom has presented. But are there any immediate questions for clarification?
I have a question, if I may.
Yes, please.
I was wondering, Ivo, if you have examples of areas or cities or places where you see something like a peak car usage, where you actually see that the car usage goes back, and what are the conditions under which this happens?
Yeah. There are several answers to that question. I think there are really cities who have taken control, and I think one of the big examples, where also the growth of people living in the city, and so who are not shrinking, which is important. So cities who are really not collapsing under the weight of their own success in terms of growth of inhabitants and of economic activity. So thinking, for instance, I live in Leuven, for instance, in Belgium, that's doing great. Again, also in the Netherlands, we have very good examples. German cities, there it's a bit back and forth also, with, depending on the political conditions. One of the answers, again, I'm working a lot on parking. If you hear, I once was in a meeting where somebody of the European Parking Association asked the sustainable mobility through, let's say, the people working in that sphere asked for their best practices in urban mobility, like Bordeaux or yeah, you have Toulouse, Lyon in France, for instance, but also Barcelona. You have a couple of these bigger cities who really have are in a mobility transition and are quite far in that. And he always managed to list the number of underground parking spaces in the big ballpark figures. So the let's say the above ground experience of a car-free city often comes with a very thorough investment in also finding a space and a sink for these cars elsewhere out of sight. So that's somehow, if we talk about housing and infrastructure, this is often at the moment still a very strong prerequisite, which then in other contexts, for instance, like in Madrid and etc., it translates actually you need intermodality at a certain moment. You need to interface with long distance modes, can be the car or the or rail or coach, for instance, and you need to find spaces in the city where these trips can be brought to the local level by an intermodal interchange. And in a lot of cities, that's car parking. But in cities who are already a bit more advanced, that these are real intermodal spaces. So that I think that's a part of the answer of what is success in that case. And then another factor of success is really to once you have these big parking volumes, try to remediate that, try to make that multifunctional within the use of cars. You can have high rotation parking, or you can do a lot with it's not only parking cars that are parked there for 23 hours a day, but you have to move into using these infrastructures for logistics, for shared mobility, or even for totally different functions, the neighborhood battery, so to think about other ways to use mobility spaces. And there's a great study from the University of Antwerp, which was called Casco, who was looking at the alternative use of underground parking spaces in city centers. So that could be nice study to visit with this group also.
Thank you very much, Ivo. I recommend, for the sake of time, that we transition over to Tom. The European context and reality is quite dense, and many old cities that are quite dense, but also a very dense network of rail and also other forms of mass transit. I would be so bold as to say that Australia is quite a different context. Tom will also be addressing another perspective of on housing planning and in relation to governance. But this is the beauty of being able to meet online across geographies, that we can also get quite diverse perspectives easily, rather than though we would love to be together in person, now we have the beauty of being able to be together online. Tom, the floor is yours.
Thanks so much, Regitza, and thank you everybody for this invitation. It's a real pleasure to be part of this session. Ivo, thank you for your presentation. I really appreciated that. And while I wasn't going to talk about transport at all, as you were speaking, I was realizing that a lot of the things that I'm talking about do have a transport dimension as well. So I might refer to some of those things as I go through. Is my screen sharing okay? Can I just quickly ask if everyone can see that and it's all fine? Thank you. Well, look, I'm from the Australian Housing and Urban Research Institute, or AHURI as we refer to it in Australia. I've been there for about 5 years. I'm part of the executive team. And before I jump into, I guess, giving you a bit of an overview of housing planning and governance in the Australian context, just a very briefly, a couple of things about myself, because it is relevant to the things I'm going to be showing you. I originally trained as an architect and worked in that profession for a few years before doing a PhD in housing and urban studies. And I looked at this particular topic actually and looked at the intensification or the consolidation of residential spaces in Australia as a policy, and how that was being governed, and also how that process was playing out. So the I guess the move from lower density to slightly higher density cities. And following that, I worked in the Victorian government, and in the role that I had there, ended up overseeing the strategic planning for metropolitan Melbourne, looking particularly at the housing component of that. And I also led the development of the apartment design standards that we have in place in Melbourne now. So that does inform some of my own perspective on this as well. Moving through, just quickly, AHURI, for those of you who don't know, we are an organisation that is fairly unique in the world. We have a direct relationship with all of the Australian governments, including the federal government, all of the state and territory governments, from whom we receive funding to deliver a program of research relating to policy. And we conduct that with our university partners, who consist of 10 Australian universities. And we deliver research on housing, homelessness, and urban issues. And the way that's done is it's very much looking at how that can integrate within the policy cycle. It does seek to directly answer and apply academic research to a policy context. So that's the context in which we're working. What I'm going to do now is give a very quick overview of housing in Australia, particularly looking at planning and governance. And I'm assuming that most people have some idea about it, but maybe don't know that much. I do know that Eva and at least has a connection to Australia, and there are possibly some others who have been here before. But I'm going to assume very limited knowledge, and I'm just going to give you a bit of an outline, and hopefully we can have in the discussion draw some of the connections or lessons that might be relevant for a European context, where I think most of you are coming from. Just very quickly, the Australian housing system exhibits the following key features, which I've got down there. And just to quickly refer to some components of that, market provision and allocation of housing is the dominant mode by far. So bureaucratic allocation or provision by government is extremely a very small part of how housing is provided. Home ownership has historically been very high in Australia. It has been a significant tenure for more than 100 years. It continued to grow through the 20th century. It reached really a high point in the early 1980s and has actually been declining since. And so Australia is one of the few countries in the developed world where home ownership is a declining tenure, although it is still the dominant tenure. The detached house is the dominant type of housing. Again, that's unusual, as Ragitza has indicated, from European context. Detached housing is by far the majority of all housing, although apartment housing and attached forms of housing have increased in their proportion of the housing stock over the last 15 to 20 years approximately, so quite recently. Social housing is highly residualised within the Australian housing system. It constitutes less than 4% of all housing. That includes both public and community housing, amounts to only that much. And because of that, it increasingly over time has been allocated to those in most extreme need. So consequently, people who live in social housing are people who have absolutely no way of participating in the housing market in any form, and often have quite high and complex needs, and are often very vulnerable people. And then, of course, in Australia, this is a colonised country, and there is an Indigenous population for whom the housing situation is, in many instances, quite dire, and exhibits quite different characteristics to other parts of the population as well. And it has become, or has been, quite marginalised within the system for a very long time. Some critical issues that we're facing with our housing system at the moment, I want to go through next. Firstly, we have a very severe affordability problem. Australia has one of the some of the least affordable housing markets in the world, and that does mean that increasingly households who are not on high incomes are finding it harder and harder to access housing affordably within Australia's cities. And on the right there, you can see a chart which I've taken from one of the AHURI research reports that we released last year, which has looked at, I guess, the decline in the affordability of and availability of rental housing to households on low incomes. And increasingly, as you can see, the actual number of dwellings in Australia across the whole country that are available and affordable to households in the bottom income quintile has become extremely concerning for policymakers and all concerned, of course. In the context of this, we have very high population and household growth. It is, and prior to the COVID pandemic, Melbourne, for example, as one of the larger Australian cities, was experiencing the highest level of population growth of any city within the OECD, actually. So there's quite high levels of household formation that need to be housed. And some of the issues with Australian housing are the poor environmental performance of the homes, and also the tendency for our cities to become polarised spatially by housing type, but also, and most concerningly, by income. So the issue of the declining affordability of housing is actually manifesting spatially within Australian cities as well. Just want to go through just a few pictures to give you a sense of, I guess, the form and nature of Australian cities and the housing that comprises them. This first image is part of I guess, the inner area of one of our capital cities. It's a suburb immediately adjacent to the centre of the city, and these suburbs, which were built in the 19th century and have been going through a process of constant transformation ever since, are actually very desirable places to be. They're very lively, they're very active, and these days, in terms of, I guess, bringing in some of that planning narrative, these are parts of the capital cities that are in many ways protected by heritage protections that value and control what can be done in these locations. However, most of Australia's cities, as I said, are made up of detached housing, and this is also 19th century and very early 20th century pre-World War I housing I think this is in Melbourne, which, as you can see, takes on that type of suburban detached housing form, which has dominated Australia's cities for more than 100 years, and continues to do so. And the next slide shows a very recent example of suburban development, which is, I guess, in many ways, a continuation of that earlier form of development. But in this case, as land has become more expensive, as demand for housing has increased, as cities have become more car dependent, you can see that that this form of development is taken to an almost absurd level in terms of how it's been delivered. And yet, enormous swathes of the area of land that is surrounding our capital cities is developed like this. At the other extreme, apartments, as I mentioned earlier, have become part of the Australian housing system in a relatively recent time frame. There are apartments dating back to early days of the 20th century, but they make up an extremely small proportion of the housing stock. There was a boom in apartments in the 1950s and 60s that was fairly widespread and did increase the number of apartments in Australian cities to a level where that type of housing came to account for somewhere between 10 and 20% of the housing stock. So again, very, very small by European standards. But what we've seen in the last 20 years is a very significant increase in very large apartment development, particularly in and around central city locations. So this is a diagram from 2016, which shows the apartment buildings that were either under construction or in the pipeline for construction at that particular time. Most of these have now been delivered. And just one thing I want to point out there, and I'll come back to the governance in just a moment, but you'll see there that the City of Melbourne, which is the local authority, really had control over a very small number of, and indeed the smallest in scale, examples of this type of development, whereas most of them are being approved by the minister who is been a part of the state government in terms of the urban governance of that, and I'll come to that in a moment as well. And just to give you some sense of, I guess, the quite extreme scale of some of this type of development, which we have been seeing in Australian cities. The diagram on the left is one that was done by a friend of mine, Leanne Hoddle, again back in 2016, and it accompanied that diagram I showed you before, which looked at one particular block within just immediately adjacent to the Melbourne Central Business District, and looked at the development that had either been approved or constructed in that block at that time. And you can see on the right-hand side there, just the extremely high level of density and the extremely, I guess, poor outcomes in terms of broader community benefit that were achieved through that process, highlighting, I guess, some of the, the absence in our planning system of adequate of tools and mechanisms to actually get social benefit in terms of, for example, social housing delivery, in terms of higher quality environmental performance and so forth from these types of development. And just a part of the exercise she was engaged in at the time was comparing what was occurring in Melbourne, a very, very wealthy city in a very developed country, with what would have been permissible in other jurisdictions, particularly through Southeast Asia as some of Australia's immediate neighbours. And the example there, you can see applying the planning and development controls that existed in Hong Kong in 2016 to that same block of land in Melbourne. You can see on the left the level of development that would have been permissible in Hong Kong compared to the level of development that was approved within Melbourne. And the photo on the right, which is more recent, actually shows the final manifestation of that particular piece of land, which is not very large. It's just basically one city block, and yet it has extreme densities. And if you contrast that with the otherwise very low density of Australian cities, it's quite a significant contrast, to say the least. And just finally, I wanted to, I guess, say something about social housing in Australia. I mentioned before it's quite a small part of the housing stock, but it is a part of the housing system where there has been more room for, I guess, difference in terms of form and in terms of being a place where some level of experimentation has occurred, and indeed some better outcomes have been achieved. So even so, on the left, the very fairly ubiquitous modernist housing block, which you see all around the world. This was a level of density and a type of apartment development that that was not occurring otherwise in Australia. In the middle, from the 1980s, the kind of medium density infill, which again was something that was not able to be achieved by the private market at the time, was being delivered in the form of social housing. And on the right-hand side, this example, which is from the same time as that, quite intense high-rise apartment development that I showed, I guess illustrates the kind of, more appropriate level of density and more human scale of housing that that was able to be achieved through, in that case, a community housing project, but which is obviously very, very different from the type of housing that was being achieved in the market. And just by the by, I have did receive a small grant, and one of the projects I'm working on at the moment is looking at the role that social housing has played in Australia as a site for innovation and market leadership, and that's an exhibition that we're hoping to put on and showcase shortly. And now finally, just on a slightly more positive note, some of the better examples of housing, because I've made it sound quite grim, but indeed we do have much very good housing in Australia as well. But this is one of the examples which has received quite a high level of awareness and praise, both here and internationally. This is again just staying within Melbourne by way of illustration, is a much more human-scaled level of density in terms of achieving an apartment housing outcome that does deliver on a range of social and other benefits, and does create a much more engaged and active street than some of those other projects that I showed you. And then finally, last slide, just talking about, I guess, the governance structure for Australian cities, and particularly housing and planning. Australia is a federation. Most of the responsibilities for planning and for housing sit at the level of the states, which is the middle level there. However, the federal government, or the Commonwealth government as we refer to it, has most of the significant levers in terms of actually achieving or directing outcomes. Things like most of the taxation revenue goes to that level of government, and it controls, for example, how taxes are raised and how finances are directed. And then local government, by contrast, and indeed by contrast to many overseas countries as well, is a fairly weak form of government. It doesn't have any constitutional status, and it has a very limited and curtailed role in terms of governing cities. I'll finish there. Thank you very much, and I look forward to the discussion. Regitza, you're on mute.
Sorry, I'd just like to immediately open the floor to the group for any questions or comments to Tom, and I would like to thank Tom very much for his presentation. But rather than listening to me, let's open the floor.
I have a question about this exhibition. When will it be?
Thank you. Yes, looking to finish the research this March, and we've already shown in Adelaide, actually, an earlier version with some of the components of the exhibition, and we're looking to have that finalised in March, and we'll showcase it in a couple of Australian cities, and love to be able to show it around the world, actually. So thank you.
Yeah.
I also have a direct question that's maybe you could enlighten us a little bit further. Your last example, or the two last examples actually, with this sort of medium density layouts, very much community focused, it seemed. How did that came about? Because it's such a polarized picture you present. Actually, indeed, quite shocking for European eyes. But then these gems come about as well. But what are the conditions under which that happens?
Yeah, thank you. The conditions are quite unique there, and it's been quite a deliberate attempt to achieve something, because what that particular development and it's about 10 different apartment buildings within a precinct that works very well together. How that has been achieved is what it achieves is something that has been the stated ambition of strategic planning policy for many years, and yet isn't being delivered. And how that one came about, and I did have some involvement in the establishment of it, was what we did was to say, look, we need to we looked at the way that, I guess, what drove those other forms of development. So why do we get that low density housing? Why do we get that very extreme high density apartment development? And by unpacking, I guess, what we call the structures of provision of those forms of housing, we then looked at ways, okay, what is the way to actually change structurally how housing is delivered? So that's in terms of how it's financed, where does the capital come from? What is the arrangement in terms of accessing debt finance, and what are the actual development risks and the market risks and the development process? So it was actually quite deliberately designed type of process, which was aimed at how do you deliver market housing, because it is a market context that we're operating in. We're not relying in that case on government intervention or subsidy, but how do you actually design the market to work to get the kind of outcomes that policy has been trying to achieve? And so some of the key, I guess, differences there were, a principal one was that the people, so those apartments are occupied by owner occupiers, and the people who were, I guess, moving into them put their hand up earlier and joined a sort of waiting list, if you like, to be part of that development process. And what that meant was it took a lot of the development risk out, but it also brought a lot of demand side factors to bear on the development process itself, because a lot of those very high density examples that I showed you before, a lot of that is international capital coming in looking for a place to park equity. It's also it's targeted at an investor class, and then it's rented out to the occupants. And what that means is, it doesn't, things like the long-term environmental performance or the design quality are not really a feature of that the actual the money is looking to achieve. Whereas what we tried to do was to get, I guess, owner occupiers who had a different set of values and a different set of expectations from an apartment to have some influence on then how that apartment was actually delivered and what it actually ended up being. And then, of course, once one of those projects got realised, everyone wanted to be part of it, and so consequently, we had this mushrooming of, in that particular precinct alone, 12 of those types of buildings that collectively work quite well together as well. And just relating it back to the transport question, another key feature there, because parking requirements are a significant issue in terms of I guess, managing the design and the affordability of development as well. In that instance, there's a train station immediately adjacent to those buildings. There's also 2 tram lines that run nearby. It's quite close to the centre of the city. It is a cyclable and walkable kind of neighbourhood. So consequently, an argument was put that parking could be reduced, and in fact, in most of those buildings, eliminated altogether. Again, that's very rare to achieve that kind of thing. And in doing that, it just opened up a whole lot of additional possibility in terms of activation of the street and in terms of, I guess, delivering more building to human uses rather than storage for cars.
Great. Thanks a lot for that answer. I also remember a previous presentation by colleagues of yours of, I think it was called
Yes.
Nightingale Housing.
Yeah, it is. Nightingale. Yes, that's
Yeah,
exactly.
Where this kind of community aspect was really key in order to organizing the ownership in a way, in such a way that you really create this community directly. Yeah, very interesting. Ivo, you have a question.
Yes, indeed. I will try to stay away from mobility as a topic. But when I see these images of these large developments of not the high rise, but the neighborhoods you showed that. So we have a problem in Europe of what we call churn. I think the fact that you have generational aspects in these new developments, so people of the same age arrive there with the building and the construction of the neighborhood, and they grow old, and then also the public functions in such a neighborhood like schools and care, they need to somehow evolve with these generational movements. Is that something you see, and is that something that governments try to manage also? That kind of, or it's really like open for the market takes care, or
yes, a bit like that. No, we do see that, and often those new suburbs are purchased by, I guess, newly forming households, often households who are about to or have just had young children. It does mean that there is, infrastructure demand in terms of schools and childcare and things like that. There is, I guess, a level of government intervention in terms of, providing those facilities. It's quite, again, not a very efficient way to do that, really. It also means that the suburbs age at the same sort of rate as well. And of course, healthcare is the other type of infrastructure that needs to go in there as well, which is a significant cost to government. Transport, interestingly, these are very car-dependent suburbs. The example that I had in the screen, there is a train station near that, not within a walkable distance, I don't think, but within a short drive, which then creates its own issues that you then have short commutes as well. And you mentioned in your talk, Ivo, and I was very interested in that chart you showed that suggested that it was the 10 to 50 kilometre distance that was the hardest one to deal with, and I think I found that quite telling, because our big cities in Australia, most of that type of development is from the 10 to the 50k radius around the central city. So it does help. It exacerbates the car dependence of those locations. There is public transport, but it's of a very radial nature and doesn't have the finer grain of penetration.
Yeah, just to what I have to, I don't remember the author of the study, but there's also a political dimension to that generational turnover. So the fact that people become less interested in sustainable solutions, with their age also, and so you are or maybe not. You can have different generational aspects. So, but this churn and the location of political views on solutions in housing or for transport is also very challenging for authorities. And so what we see in Europe is that the city centers are progressive in a lot of cases. The outer suburbs are conservative, and that creates tensions when they are under the same local authority. And that also, when you have movements of people and gentrification, you get there are political consequences there as well.
Yes, absolutely. We see the same pattern here.
Good. We have about 10 minutes left, and I think it will be interesting to look a little bit at why we started this series, and maybe see if we can make a connection with that. Because of course, I mean, this series was very much, we had this previous session trying to address the topics we needed to raise. But what was clear actually is that quite generally worldwide, we've seen this kind of housing crisis. And Ivo introduced also, perhaps we are similarly having a kind of mobility crisis coming up. And of course, these contexts throughout the world are very different, but this crisis is something that binds us together. And so I would like to spend the last 10 minutes on maybe some discussion on how to cope with this. Of course, I think, well, we've shown some highlights. I think Ivo also pointed towards quite a strong policy framework, a lot of role for government in the European context. Tom, maybe your good examples was very much community driven and created by that. Can we get some lessons from there? Are there any thoughts from any of you attending? Otherwise, I'm going to just.
I'm going to. Oh, we'll let Marie please go ahead.
No, Regitze, please.
Well, I'd just like to point out that our upcoming session will be on housing alternatives. But housing alternatives, we could see it as, let's say, housing typologies, but it's just as relevant to talk about alternatives in terms of financing, or alternatives in terms of connectivity, and what kind of mobility there is. And one does notice projects that maybe have in their housing alternative design, they're also addressing mobility. So I just want to point out, I think there's a very strong link between the topic of mobility and proximity with the topic of alternative housing. And then how does one finance these alternatives?
Oh. Yes, indeed. Interesting. Marie.
Yeah, thank you for the presentations and contributions. Maybe in France, we try and solve this kind of link between housing and mobility, since possibly you heard about the Grand Paris Express, Greater Paris Express network, which is to be finished by 2030, and already first line open. It is very interesting because it's going to be a circular line around Paris, but not in Paris, but some distance of Paris, linking all the territories and suburbs around Paris, which means a very quick and comfortable train with 68 stations, meaning that people, instead of always for commuting having to go to the center of Paris and then going another way to join their work or whatever, can just go around. So it's going to be linking airports, hospitals, universities, and main cities. So this is going to be a huge progress. This is also a real achievement in architecture and engineering. The idea, of course, is to take advantage of this to develop new districts around these polarities, because it's unique, or maybe you've got this, this kind of opportunities once or twice a century. So it's a unique opportunity to, if you are interested through Paul, I can send you a map. We could then take advantage, in the good sense of this, to foster new urban development and city planning and all this. But, and then it links to the third term of today, which is governance. Unfortunately, we don't have the appropriate governance for the Greater Paris level. So that means that it's mostly the developers and real estate companies which build the new districts. Of course, there is law and for social housing and all this, but we are currently missing the opportunity of joining housing and transportation in a general interest approach. Thank you.
That's very interesting, Marie. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much for that addition. Also thinking about a more networked structure. I think that's very interesting, from a very much central oriented towards a much more network oriented approach on the metropolitan level, on the large scale urban region, and the need for governance that goes in line with that. Only a couple of minutes left. Some other thoughts? Someone wants to join in? Carlos is putting it in the chat. Maybe you can say something about that, Carlos. Do you want to chip in?
Well, I tried only to introduce some ideas from my experience in IFHP, because I see the problems, the managed problems, these problems are always or still the same: mobility, sustainability, cost, prices, and density, and so on. I myself was dealing with them nearly 50 years and see that they still remain or are coming back with other conditions. It's true, because the mobility change, possibilities change, the building possibility change, but the ground problem are nearly the same. How to implement it. And the biggest problem is the contrast or the conflict with the property rights.
Yeah.
You have to deal with landowners, you have to deal with constructor builders, housing, the companies, investors. And I see sometimes the technical or planning solutions comes not to reality, because there are so many problems, political problems, economic problems, and so on. It's only I wanted to say it's my experience. Sorry.
Yeah, well, thank you very much indeed. That puts things into perspective, and I think also we had a very nice discussion on that in our Berlin convening. Anyone else?
I have a question to you, Marie, actually. You were saying we don't have the level of governance necessary for the to make, let's say, the connection between mobility and housing in the Grand Paris happen. My question would be, for yourself, what would be the missing link? What kind of, is it about harmonization of the existing layers? Is it about creating a new layer? And so yes, which one? What is the missing link?
Well, thank you for asking. That's the key issue. I think this is not a missing link. This is a whole set of missing links. Plural. And in fact, unfortunately, as you may know, we relatively failed. We had a very interesting experience with the Paris Métropole, which was a gathering of all local authorities working with the French central government. But unfortunately, I would say political, but not in the noble sense, but or the meaning, but political things, mean issues of powers and all that, made and complicated things also, because as you know, and it was we saw it also in the very interesting slide that Tom Alves showed up about the different cycle of governance. So we are also faced with this. And of course, the people in every position, you know, that tend to defend their structure. And there was also a question of perimeter and tax harmonization and all this, a whole set of things you can imagine. So I would tend to say, not pretending to have an answer to this very important question Fiona's, but the thing would be certainly cooperation around projects and programs, but also maybe a governance where everybody is involved. I mean, for instance, there are things which can be treated at the closer level, others at metropole level, others at regional, national, and European. And the thing is that maybe the metropole region would be an interesting thing with sort of a two levels. You know, when it's regional large questions which are at stake, then the elected people, it's in this configuration, they vote and work. But when the focus, the metropolitan issues are concerned, then the same people, they dedicate the assembly, I explained badly, but they dedicate the assembly to this. That would be interesting, because instead of having a fight between metropole and region, since it's the same elected people and the same administration and technicians who are in charge, but just changing their role according to the public policy they have to deal with, maybe there wouldn't be this destructive competition. Well, it's to make a long story short, because I would be very happy to comment much more on this, but I don't want to take time.
Yeah. No, thank you very much. I think anyhow, this governance issue we should focus on more. I think Regitze said that right. Regitze, maybe you want to close the session, because I think we've run out of time.
Well, I'd like to thank everyone for joining. I'd like to thank Ivo and Tom. And on the note of cross-border collaborations, which this is, I would also like to point out that IFHP and VDM collaborating, this is also to cross borders, physical borders, but also but also governing borders, also to talk about the level of regions, which has now been pointed out by Marie quite explicitly. And it is very important to address how do we collaborate across different levels of governing bodies. And I hope that going forward that we can compile different models of, for example, being presented today, different models of collaborating across physical borders, but also governing borders, because I think then collectively in these sessions we can work together to have a body of information that can help us compare how things are done. So with that, I would like to thank everyone, and I'd also highly encourage you and those you know to join our upcoming sessions. And our next Learning Lab is on the 26th of February with a focus on alternative housing models, which we already have begun to hear something about today.
Yes. All right. Great. Hope to see you then. Bye-bye. Have a good afternoon
Thank
or
you.
evening. Good night.